Welcome to Soundstage Insider, the podcast that takes you behind the scenes of the film and television industry. We're bringing you the visionary directors and producers, the talented cinematographers, editors, sound designers, and more who really make the magic happen. We delve deep into their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs. So let's go beyond the red carpet and discover a fascinating world of behind-the-scenes talent. In today's episode, we delve into the captivating realm of post-production sound. We have two incredibly talented individuals joining us, Margit Pfeiffer and David Acord, who between them have worked on some of the most iconic films and television shows in history. This includes Star Wars, Avengers, Inglourious Bastards, Guardians of the Galaxy, Hunger Games, Star Trek, Batman. The list just goes on and on. And they're here today to share their insights with us. So, let's get started. Before we get to David and Margit, let's first understand what post-production sound is all about. In its simplest form, it's the process of enhancing and refining the audio elements in a film or television production after principal photography has been completed. It's the art of creating and manipulating sound to immerse the audience in the story and elevate the overall cinematic experience. The history of post-production sound is tightly interwoven with the evolution of the film industry itself. In the early days of silent films, musicians and orchestras played live during movie screenings to accompany the action on the screen. But with the introduction of synchronized sound in the late 1920s, the need for dedicated audio professionals emerged. First off, actually, Margit, I'd like to go to you. I'd love to hear what it is that you do every day. On your IMDb for Andor, which is what we're talking about today, you are listed as supervising sound editor. So what exactly is that role?
So my role, we have two supervising sound editors on Andor, and I handle the dialogue, ADR, and loop group side of things. So I work with the actors, record their lines. I work with loop group and flesh out scenes with humans. I focus on the different types of languages in Andor. I cut the dialogue. I clean up the production sound, and that's what I do.
Very cool. And what about you, David? You've got a couple of extra roles in addition to supervising sound editor. You're listed as re-recording mixer and sound designer. So what do those roles entail?
So the sound designer part is just you're in charge of the sound effects in a broad way. You create new sound effects or record sound effects. You're in charge of the shape of the sound effects track. That's kind of your responsibility. You're supervising the sound effects. On the flip side of that, re-recording mixer, it's a different job altogether. Your job is to pull together all the dialogue stuff that Margit's cut together, and the effects stuff that my effects team has cut together, and the Foley stuff. And then John Bickley will bring in Nick Britell's score, and you got to kind of make sense of all of that and kind of make all of that listenable, basically, so it just doesn't play as a wash of sound. Yeah.
So going back to earlier in your career, how did you start out in this world? Obviously, you're working at a very elite level now. It's very exciting, the kind of work that you do. How did you get to this point? I know, David, you've worked on a lot of Star Wars and a whole bunch of other stuff in addition to that too. What was your first forays into this industry like?
My first, I guess, paying job in the film world was in production. I started out in production. I did production work for 7 years before I got into post. The first gig I got was actually in special effects, like practical effects, on 12 Monkeys, Terry Gilliam movie. Yeah. Shot in Philadelphia and Baltimore. And that's where I was living in that area at the time in Delaware. Yeah, I did production. I ended up meeting the post-production mixer on that show on 12 Monkeys, Jay Mahar. And got to be friends with Jay, and he ended up hiring me as his assistant for the next few years. I guess probably 3 or 4 years later, I moved to Los Angeles, and then was working with some different people there. I just kind of bounced around working in production for about 7 years before I landed a job in in post at Skywalker, and the first gig I got at Skywalker was Attack of the Clones, was episode 2.
Wow.
And working as an apprentice under Matthew Wood and Ben Burt. So it was like kind of striking, gold right there for your first post-production sound for a guy that wants to become a sound designer. That was like, wow, that's you don't get any better than that. So then I've just kind of worked with Matt Wood a whole bunch over the years on several Star Wars projects, and continue to. It's been I've been very lucky in that regard.
Yeah, that's fantastic. What about you, Margit?
I started in Munich. I started at a studio where there was a picture department and a sound department. And so I initially did a few shows on location as a picture assistant, and also cutting dialogue and sound effects and learning to mix. And then that film I went to Scotland with on location, a picture assistant, and then did post sound on afterwards, had a premiere in Los Angeles. And so I thought, well, this is obviously the place to be in Hollywood if you want to work in film. And I moved to the US. Was not an easy start initially, but I worked my way into, I got onto shows at different studios. I had worked at Sony and Disney and Warner Brothers and Sound Deluxe, and then later Formosa Group, and now it's Skywalker Sound. So I've seen a lot of different places and different methods of how to do it. And for Andor, I actually worked in the UK most of the time. And we worked over there at Delaney, we mixed, and at Higherworks I was embedded with the editorial and VFX department, and yeah.
To construct immersive sound that brings distant worlds to life, much like a painter builds layers of colour on a canvas, David and Margit construct the sound piece by piece. It takes great skill to combine these layers in a way that is believable and impactful, heightening the emotion of the scene. And so, David, I'm interested in the order in which things are layered up. So there's multiple layers in a session when you're, creating these episodes. There's sort of the environmental stuff, there's the dialogue, there's the sound effects. Yeah. Is there a consistent order in which you start working to layer these episodes up, or is it just inspiration, whatever feels right at the moment?
Generally, I guess broadly, I would start with the dialogue. That's the most important thing that you want to hear is the dialogue, of course. So you want to start with the dialogue. I mean, yeah. So it's the goal when you're mixing is to tell the story, right? You want to make sure that the story comes across in the mix as well as it does, with the visual, the filmmaking. So you want to make sure your dialogue is heard. The second thing you want to do is the music. The music's there as a sort of it's an emotional grounding tool for the audience. So you want to make sure you're hitting all the right beats with the music, that you're capturing the intent of the composer and the director for what they want to do with the music situationally. And then you'll go into effects and Foley and work around, the music and dialogue. That's the main, I guess, sort of the moments where you have the most handoff sort of decisions to make as far as what you're going to hear and when comes between when music and effects are both trying to accomplish the same thing, or both trying to tell the story in their own way. It's like you've got two people in the room trying to talk over each other, but they're kind of saying the same thing in a different way. And so you kind of have to kind of push one to the side a little bit and favor one over the other. And then, if there's a moment where, you like what this person's saying, you want to hear them, or we're going to push you away and listen to this other person talk for a little while. It's sort of that conversation has to sort of be developed in the mix. So that we're telling the story in an interesting way, hopefully, and that we're not having everybody sort of talk over each other, if that metaphor makes sense.
Yeah. And presumably in that process of discovery, of putting everything together and it finding its place, are there times when you realize you're missing something and you have to go back and create something from scratch, or maybe do more Foley or do more loop group stuff?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when editors are cutting dialogue or cutting Foley or cutting effects, or even when I'm making sound design piece, you have like a sort of a vision of what this is going to sound like, in your head when you're working on it. And then when everything kind of comes together, it's not uncommon that your vision will kind of evaporate.
Right. Yeah.
when you see it all come together, it's like, oh yeah, that's not quite what I imagined that was gonna be. Or sometimes an editor just has a different idea of what the scene is going to sound like, or the picture editor, or the director, or even me. There's different people have different ideas. There's no right or wrong as far as this is a music moment, or this is an effects moment, or this is we don't care about the dialogue in this scene. Oh, we totally care about the dialogue in this scene. There's so many different ways you can approach it. The real trick is to do it the way that Tony likes, I guess.
Well, the real trick, I'd add one more thing, which I love having everything come together in the mix. It's the first time you hear it all together. You hope, you obviously you addressed all the notes, and then you have different characters in the room and the filmmakers. So you have the picture editor, a director, a producer, a music editor, and the sound editors and mixers. And it's wonderful to then see what plays the best, and also how to carve it out. What do you want attention to be, what do you want the attention of the audience to focus on in that moment, but also how to not make it cluttered. And what should, is it an intimate dialogue moment? Yes, you want to feature that, but it's also fun to go into the sound effects or let the music swell. And it really, how to make a build. An example would be in episode 206, the big heist resolve and then the spaceship flying out. You want to build up to that. So sometimes you want to feature, you want to be more quiet up front to let that to allow for room. It's almost like a composition to allow dynamic range to go to.
Yeah, it's a really good point. You got to have some place to go. If you start off at 10, you're not, there's no 11. So you got to find a spot. And like you mentioned, Margit, it's a dynamic sort of exercise too. It's not always just a straight linear line in a scene like that escape scene in 206. It's a bit of a roller coaster to get to that climactic point.
So, Margit, a big part of what you do is dialogue. That's your focus, right? Is that what you said?
Yes.
And David said that dialogue is king, really, a lot of the time in the mix. So you're pretty important.
That. No, I don't think so. But
can we get you a T-shirt with that on it?
No, please don't. No. I always feel like and I feel like everybody who goes into sound for movies really wants to go into sound design, which I initially did want as well. This is where you build and play and you create, and I think it's exciting to give life and sound to things that have no sound in real life, like a spaceship or an alien, or I consider it the more fun part of the job. Now, the dialogue side of it, I feel like is more, you're constantly busy fixing things that are broken, like you have every single angle, you have a different noise, you have a different background, you sometimes have an off-mic situation, or you have crackles on your microphone, or you can't understand it at all, or you have a multitude of problems, so it's all about fixing it. Like my whole day and my cruise day is all about ironing this out and to make it sound like it was all shot in a single take and it had always been perfect before. Now I noticed with the different types of directors you work with, if it's a writer-director, you'll have a greater emphasis on the dialogue and the mix sometimes, I feel. They're very in tune with their words. They definitely want to hear everything. And yes, you should hear everything. You want to understand the story and the story points, of course. But yeah, so I love doing dialogue. I think sound design is more fun.
Right. Well, just to sort of nerd out a little bit for a second, how do you fix things? Is it getting in there with the little pencil thing in RX or whatever it is and taking out the sounds that shouldn't be there? And
yes. Yeah. So initially, we have the tracks we get from the cutting room, which is often the mix track that was recorded in production. And then my assistant will create an assembly that has all the different mics. There's certain mix downs, then there's lav mics and boom mics. The lavs would be on the individual actors. The booms would try to cover the overall of the scene. Sometimes you have a plant mic. You always hope you have enough options, and you always have something to cut to. But even just like every single picture editor is a different sound cut as well. And so I try to balance out. Obviously, primarily the focus is on keeping the voice and the lines, as crisp and clean as you can. Sometimes a combination of a boom with a laugh works great. Sometimes only the boom or the laugh will work. And if neither works, I'll have to do ADR for the scene or for a line. And to clean it out, yes, there's a multitude of tools. You mentioned Isotope RX, which is the main tool I use. There's several others as well, but I'm incredibly happy with RX. There's things are fixable now that you couldn't fix before.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of very tedious little scrubbing. I mean, it's syllable by syllable, almost frame by frame, but you can fix the large majority of things, and in the end, in the final product, you want the impression that the dialogue has always sounded great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think there's space for AI to come in and help with some of that tedious work, or is that too scary?
Well, I have been thinking about that. I've been wondering about it. I'm very fascinated by AI, also for sound applications. I'm already, ultimately it's all algorithms in a sense, where Isotope already has algorithms to make it easier. And then AI, could it improve the process? At this point in time, I think I would be happy to work with AI if there's an opportunity to get great results. But I don't think it will replace us for a very long time, because just the amount of decision making and the problems you come across and how to fix them is not as simple. If you had, I guess as we talked about a podcast audio track, you want the ambience to be really quiet. We're sitting here in a single take. The microphones are stationary. So that is an easy thing to run through something. But when there's 1,000 variables and they're all different from cut to cut to cut, from line to line or sentence to sentence, every time you see a picture edit, it's a lot of trial and error. I'm curious what it will be able to do, but I don't think post-production sound or picture editing will be replaced anytime soon.
Yeah. To make it about me for a second, as a voice actor, we're very scared of AI taking our jobs.
Yeah.
But one thing that we're noticing, and people who hire us have been, when they've been trying to get AI to work, is that it's very hard to direct AI and to ask and to have it do what you want it to do. And especially with such a creative field that you guys are in, I should imagine that's always going to be a hurdle that's almost insurmountable for it.
Well, the focus on voice acting, obviously, but also actors reenacting scenes they played, or voice acting afterwards for group or anything specific you want to cover. There's so much nuance in a human voice. There's intonation, there's the projection, there's the performance. And I always say on an ADR stage, I can fix almost everything. I can fix, sync. I can fix a little bit of a pattern of speech. I can fix the pitch. I can fix, any kind of noises. But what I cannot do is create the exact performance. And even, a lot of, let's say, the people who would like to be actors, it's even hard for a human to create the right emotion at the right time in the right form or match themselves. So you're trying to have an algorithm do that for you, but how do you explain the nuance you feel?
Yeah.
It's not a line of code.
Yeah, absolutely. David, do you have any thoughts on AI in this space?
I guess a similar sentiment. I think that it might be a useful tool to have in your toolkit. There might be something there. I haven't seen any purely AI sound design tools like where you can just say, give me a spaceship or whatever, and it's going to generate. Maybe that's coming. I don't know, but I think it would be a similar problem of directability in a way, of tuning something like that, or making adjustments, or when we have spotting sessions with directors and where you watch the movie, or you watch the episodes, and you point out things like, that spaceship should sound like that weapon should sound like this creature sounds like that, blah, blah, blah. And you have this sort of discussion about what sound effects should be like in the project. Having that conversation with AI, I just don't see that happening. I don't see that you would have any nuanced conversation about sound effects. I think it'd just be kind of perfunctory. Having said that, there probably are AI tools out there that might be useful. There might be some certain things where it can be sort of assistive rather than a replacive sort of approach. I think that's certainly possible.
Yeah.
And, it'd be kind of interesting, honestly.
Margit and David craft everything that you hear in the Disney Plus television series Andor, and there's no better example of the power and impact of their craft than in episode 6 of season 1, The Eye. Combining intense action, intimate dialogue, gunfights, spaceships, large crowds, and even a meteor shower, this episode alone is a masterclass in post-production sound. Now, you may have heard the terms Foley and ADR before, possibly even loop groups, but I wanted to know exactly what these are and what this work entails. And you'd actually mentioned earlier that you work with the Foley artists and you do ADR and loop groups and things like that, right? Could you explain a little more about what those are? Because that's additional recording that is added on later in the process. Could you explain what those things are?
So ADR is automated dialogue replacement. For example, when I get the production sound, occasionally you'll have, airplane noise or anything you can't necessarily remove, or you have two actors talking on top of each other at the same time, or you want to add things. And so the actors come to the studio. Sometimes we do sessions remotely, but most of the time we prefer to do it in person at a studio, and we have them do their lines, to match the performance and the cadence and the projection, the intonation, basically get back into the emotion of the scene and deliver the same performance they did on set with possibly different lines. And loop group would be we assemble a group of people. So if you think of the prison scene in Andor or the crowd scenes on Ferrix, anytime you see a lot of people, you want to have a wall bed where you have different kinds of, in this case, on Ferrix, we had different languages. We had Huttese as an alien language, but we also had English. And then when we're on Aldani, we had chants in Aldani, and we shot the kids in Canary as group, but also with the actors. And so we flesh out the people. So you create a crowd, you shoot specifics. If you see someone on screen or you need let's say death grunts or fight efforts, that's what I record with them. It was actually great fun.
Yeah. I'm intrigued. How do you choose the talent to go into are they sort of regulars, people you work with on the regular? Not that I'm trying to get in on it. It is.
Well, on Star Wars, there's a very wonderful loop troupe, and it's run by Matt Wood. And so those are the people. On season 1, we had to do this remotely, which was an interesting setup, each one in their home studio and having, multiple people perform at the same time. The benefit of that was for editorial, it was fantastic because you had access to each individual performance. So you could use all the elements and mix and match. And, you always struggle with the amount of people you get. You always wish you had a larger crowd, but, so you can shuffle it around and make it, appear bigger, which is what we do.
So you back to doing it all in studio now?
Probably so.
So I'm intrigued to hear what a typical day for you guys is like when working on a show like Andor. Is there a typical day? If there is, what is a typical day? Margit, why don't you kick off?
So a typical day, it really depends of the of the phase of the project we're in. Right now, I'm in editorial. So I get the tracks, I cut my way through, I'm queuing ADR, I'm looking what the loop group needs will be. I have cutting room requests to fulfill. I'm looking for any sound issues that might need more, attention later on. And then there's different phases. So once I go to a mix stage, we do pre-mixes. I obviously try and have all the dialogue, ADR, and group ready and prepped for Dave to do the first initial pass on, still by himself in a premix. And then when we go to the final mix stage, it's all about interacting with the clients and seeing what their creative, vision is and choices choices will have to be made on the mix stage. And so depending on that, it's, or if I prepare for a day to go to ADR, I'll obviously make sure I have all my cues, last minute line changes. Are we doing it remotely? Are we doing it in person? Who's attending the session? Who's coming? How do we manage the different characters in the order they come in, what scenes are we doing. And then loop group is really fun because it's a more a social event. You have a lot of people obviously talking at the same time, which is part of the project. But also we often have great laughs, and that's more closer to creating something from scratch, I feel, and I do that with loop group. But there's a very different setup for each day.
And when they do the loop group recordings, do they have a screen where they're watching what's going on in the scene, or are you just explaining? Oh, okay.
We basically, I provide cues and we look at the scene, and then each person, if we record specifics, each one picks a character they're going to cover, or we put a bit down first, a wall a bit, so we cover the general tone of the scene. I like to shoot like little, vignettes and pockets I can slide around and repurpose throughout. And it's all about not cluttering the overall soundtrack. So we're in a busy, for example, in episode 12, we're in the busy epic battle at the end. You don't want wall-to-wall screaming. Right. I think it's a waste of time to shoot it that way. And so it's just to focus on the things you need. You want to have a few of the important screams. You want to feel the pain. You want to have the death grunts. You want to have attack yells. You want to have a certain bit, and for the bit, I look for the energy. That it has to either have an angry energy or a hurt energy, or it's whispers, or whatever you're after, whatever you're trying to feature in that moment. But I always keep it short and sweet. Focus on it for a second, and then let something else feature that in the soundtrack.
Yeah. What about you, David? I presume it depends what hat you're wearing.
Yeah. It would start off early in the project. On the sound design phase, which is coming up. That probably we'll get into that in a few months on Andor. And that's just a lot of dialogue with John Gilroy and Tony Gilroy about the sound design, about what's this area like? What's the vibe here? What's this ship's deal? What's this droid all about? What do these creatures do? And just sort of have that conversation about so we can kind of zero in on what they're after. Collaborate on the sound design, basically. Nail some of those pieces down, then the effects editors and Foley editors will start, Foley walkers, and then we get into the editorial phase, kind of towards the tail end of my design phase, and then I'll flip into mix mode. And then I'm pre-mixing. I'm pre-mixing dialogue and ADR and effects and Foley. Spend I guess about a week on that, and then we'll go over, we'll stack up a few of those episodes pre-mixed. And then we'll go to Delane Lee in London and final mix with the whole gang. We'll do like 3 episodes at a time over there for like a month.
Well, actually, moving on from that, I did want to ask you about the collaborative approach when it comes to sound design. And when you're creating sounds for a new world, a new spaceship, a new gun, whatever it is, how much are you in dialogue with like the director and the production team, or are you given quite free rein to kind of figure stuff out yourself and present a few options?
It depends on the project and your relationship with the director and the picture editors. If you've never worked with a particular team before, there's going to be quite a bit of dialogue and quite a bit of back and forth, mainly for my benefit to learn somebody's aesthetics, their tastes, and where their mindset is at for sound effects. If it's somebody new I'm working with, it might take a little while to kind of nail down, like, okay, this is what they want. Then I can kind of put myself in that frame of mind and start creating. Somebody that I've worked with a bunch, like Dave Filoni or somebody like that, he trusts me enough. We have more of a shorthand. It's a lot easier for me to generate sounds for him because I already kind of know his tastes, and he trusts me to kind of just kind of go for it and do whatever. And then then there's sort of a third thing where it's some directors and picture editors really just enjoy having options, and it just becomes about like give me an A, B, and C, and give me a D option that's totally off the wall. There's some people just really like to have options in front of them, and it's kind of everybody's got their own method.
I remember watching a video, I think it was Apple did it. It was about Skywalker sound, and there was a section where they were going through the like Lucasfilm library of sounds. And it looked fantastic. Yeah. Obviously, you guys have access to that. It must be pretty fun to go through and get these vintage original sounds from, I don't know, like modular synths, or I don't know where they got all these sounds from or how they constructed them. But like, do you use those in constructing new, or do you reference those? Like, so it's like a Bible?
It is. I mean, for Star Wars anyway, all of our legacy sound effects, all the legacy stuff created by Ben Burt, starting in 1970, I guess 5, he probably started recording and making sounds all the way up through Revenge of the Sith. All of that's all great stuff, and making modern Star Wars projects like something like Andor or Mandalorian or whatever, where we reference legacy assets, like TIE fighters or X-Wings or whatever. Take, for example, the TIE fighters in Andor season 1. Absolutely, that's a Ben Burt sound. It's the classic TIE scream. But because the rest of the show is, has a very definitive 21st century sound to it, we want to elevate that 1975 sound effect to make it sound, like it exists in a soundtrack that was made in 2022. So it's just me trying to be overly polite about using 60-year-old recordings or 50-year-old recordings. It can be tricky. So we want to play with that a little bit. We want to give it a little more edge, or, I might in some cases kind of deconstruct that sound effect and go back to the elephant scream sound and try some new things with that, but it's all Ben's sound. It's all that original sound. And then I kind of modify it for legacy assets. And that's not to say there's not new stuff. There's loads of new stuff in the Star Wars universe that we have to generate from scratch.
Very cool. Margit, do you get your hands on all those vintage sounds? Can you play with those too as part of your position?
I assume I could. I don't really have to in terms of, covering the dialogue track and all that. And then the only thing you would want to consider, the overall Star Wars, grittiness and all that, and how to, what the aliens sound like. But this is also something that Dave handles, and how the voices are processed. So it all fits into the overall sonic soundscape.
So actually, is the processing done after you've worked on the dialogue and then for the alien sounds, or some guy's in his helmet or whatever?
Yeah, so I tend to clean out, whatever we get with production, I will try to preserve, including some production effects. And then it depends, for B2, there was a debate, and you would always investigate this automatically. You'd have, you do a voice casting, seeing who will be the final voice for that machine in this case, and then you'll record it and then you'll process it. In B2, in Andor, our puppeteer, Dave Chapman, did such a wonderful and emotional performance on set that there was a long debate back and forth. But initially, when we kept him. He was too perfect to replace. Yeah. We wanted that humanity for the droid.
Film and television production is very much a team sport, and as such, doing your job well helps other people on the team to do their jobs well. So I asked David and Margit what they wished other people in the production chain knew about what they do.
That's a Margit question for sure.
Okay, yeah, let's go to Margit for this one.
I definitely have an opinion.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. What are your thoughts on that?
I do have a strong opinion on that. And I always feel like, sound is a little bit of the stepchild on a big movie set, understandably. I mean, there's so much going on. And but I always think it's first of all, you should always hire a fantastic production sound mixer. They're worth their money 10 times over. If you walk away with a terrible production soundtrack, just the costs of ADR stages, bringing everybody in, the time and labor and the editorial and the mix time spent on it. So you always want to make sure you have a great production sound mixer. And then on set, there will always be all kinds of noises and things to deal with. So that's normal. But if the production sound mixer has a great relationship with the rest of the crew and is being heard, when he says, could we just come a little closer with the microphone here or there? Some some filmmakers are very open to that and respectful of sound. Some are not always. And so you can hear that in the track. I hear it, it gets into my hands and I can tell. Again, Danny Hambrook on Andor. I'm a great fan of his. As I'm cutting my way through, there's a boom or two or a live or a lav mic. There are so costumes, like the different types of fabrics often also generate their own noise. But in this case, there was a scene with Cassian, and he put 2 lav mics on a noisy outfit, and I always had something to cut to. So I can, for Dave, in the mix, I can present him a boom and in combination with a lav, which has the best sound if you match them and you phase them correctly. And so I'm really happy. That's all I ask, to always have something I can cut to and as cleanly recorded as possible. And some things are completely out of their control. You're shooting in a rain scene. Of course, you're not going to get crisp and clean dialogue. I mean, some of these things you just have to fix in post.
Yeah, and then someone's cell phone goes off or something happens.
Hardly ever, but you'll have a period piece and you have airplanes flying,
right.
or different props, or even on Andor we had Ferrix. There's a gravel floor, so I of course hear the crunch in my track on the town plaza, and so I mean it's things like that. You can't, it's inevitable. You're going to run into some of these things, and you just have to deal with it. Yeah, which is okay, totally fine. Keeps us busy.
And presumably, the less ADR the actors have to do, the better for their perspective and everyone's.
Much better. And I've worked with several filmmakers, including Quentin Tarantino and Tony Gilroy, who really do not want to do ADR. I mean, I always feel it's the writer-directors who are very in tune with their dialogue and the performances, and they love the way this has been performed on set. They don't want to redo it. And I'm also completely in favor of that. So the big goal is to try and fix everything. I mean, a line change or a newly added line or, something like that. Yes, you have to go in and shoot, but the rest should be preserved as much as possible.
As we're wrapping up here, I'd love to get your opinions on your favorite part of your job and possibly your least favorite part of your job as well, because that's sometimes more interesting. But David, do you want to kick off with that?
I mean, I think the design phase, I think all that trial and error is probably my favorite part. It's, it ends up being like a learning exercise for me anyway. I learn something new every time I get into that design phase and start playing around. It's a discovery for the show. It's also personal discovery for me. I always find some new way of doing something or some new tool or whatever. And even if it's not even for the show you're working on, you're like, oh yeah, that's going to be cool for, this whatever down the road. And I'll make a note of that and stash it or whatever and probably forget about it. But then the least favorite part, boy, I don't know.
Putting you on the spot a bit here.
Yeah, that one's a bit on the spot. Matching ADR, how about that? That's my least favorite.
Okay, not fun.
That's very, very difficult. It is getting ADR to match production, and that's probably my least favorite thing to do.
Are there actors that are particularly good and particularly not good at doing that kind of thing? Does it really depend on the actor, really, with
Yes. There's a difference. I mean, again, it goes into, obviously, you want to make sure that in terms of the production sound, you match the sound quality. I mean, you want to match the tone of it all, but then also the performance. And the real tricky position here is if, let's say it's a very emotional scene that's being played, for the actor to go back into that moment, sometimes a year after they wrap the film shoot. They performed the scene for maybe a day in their life, and they have to go back into it in a studio and find right into it in front of a microphone without anyone to play against. So I find if it's not a close, very, very close performance match, you will always, notice that it's ADR. Again, sync and cadence and a lot of these things are very fixable, and obviously the sound quality of the recording. That's why we shoot in a studio with all the gear and all that, and the engineer. But if the performance doesn't match, it becomes really tricky, to fix.
Right.
To say the least.
Yeah.
So is that your least favorite part of your job, or is there something else?
Not at all. So my part of my job, actually, that part is one of the things I like the best. So I really like working with the actors on the stage to guide. Everybody has a different way of guiding them, and so I found on Andor with Diego, for example, and doing ADR, it was fascinating to see. Initially the Tony Gilroy, the showrunner, writer, director, and producer will give instructions as a writer-director, how he envisioned the scene, what is the purpose of the scene, what is the function of that character in that scene, and how he guides them to that performance as he would on set with, recording it for the first time. A picture editor on the ADR stage will have the overall function of the performance. How do the elements work together in the scene? What should it sound like? What is it for? And then Diego's approach is obviously, how does an actor find into the character? So it's fascinating for me to listen to him find his way into this particular character. And I will only, so Dave will work on all of this, and then I will only say, certain things if we need to modify something that sounds specific. But I find it fascinating, the different approaches, how it all comes together and how much work goes into it to make it sound so as if it never happened.
So, if post-production sound has sparked your interest, how would you break in? Here's David and Margit's advice to newcomers.
There's really kind of no right or wrong way to kind of break into any part of the film industry, really. I can't speak for all areas, but I've worked with so many different people that have come into the film industry from so many different angles, and I don't know that anyone is better than the other. Film school seems to be a very direct route, because you end up, just by virtue of going to school with other people that are going to do the same thing you're going to do, they're going to be your colleagues, right off the bat. And so you have like a built-in network immediately. If you're coming from, a non-film school route or coming from the outside in some way, it's definitely more difficult because, again, it's all about that network. It's all about knowing this person needs, X, Y, and Z, type people to work on this job or whatever, and just getting your name out there, getting your, letting people know that, you have this skill set and you can do whatever. It's great if you have all those skills, but if you don't have a network to sort of share that with, then you're just, you're in a void. And so you got to get to know people in the industry, in some way, to break in. That's sort of, it's such a horrible answer when you say it out loud, but it's the truth. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Margit, you weren't from this country, a bit like me. You came over. And so how did you break in?
I studied audio engineering in Munich at the time, and I did an internship at a company that built studios all around Germany and all around Europe. And during my internship, I was asked to translate the back then version D24 Pro Tools manual into German, and I added half of the translation was extra workflows. So by the time, and it was right at the start of Pro Tools, being more common within the industry.
Yeah.
So when I moved to the US and I knocked on different, music studios and then post houses, and so the first question was, well, do you know Pro Tools? Yeah, I really do.
I wrote the book on it.
Yeah, I wrote the entire book. They tested me with it in audio engineering college, and the book had my name in it. They're like, should we even ask you a question? Feel free to ask. But so I would really advise people to, find, specialize in certain things. I think when we're talking about AI, or if you want to work in sound or in film and film editing, you have to know Pro Tools. You should be totally familiar with all the typical, plugins and workflows, or, the Avid for picture editing, if you want to be on big feature films. So have your technical skills, developed. And then I think it is now probably a little easier to get your foot in the door because you have an easier way of networking. You can find people online. You can find, what studio does somebody work for, and cold call or a cold email. And I would start with something as simple, and that worked really well for me. And I would start with something simple as asking, just for a little bit of advice or time. If you just burst through the door saying, hey, I'm ready, I'm going to, take your job and I'll do it perfectly. Well, you should introduce yourself first and be visible, like if you have a coffee with someone and then the next time an opening comes up, well, who will they think of? The person they've already interacted with. And I also think it's really important within the business to provide training. I feel those opportunities seem to become less. You have much smaller crews, much less time on shows. And yeah, but it's easier to find out who works on what.
To build on what Margit's saying about the it's easier to contact people. It's also easier these days the tools are more accessible now these days than they were, 20, 25, 30 years ago. The tools are much more readily available. I mean, when I started out, Pro Tools was sort of financially prohibitively expensive for me to have something at my house for that, let alone 30 years ago, nobody, it was just like dubbing machines. Nobody had that at their home. These days, it's like the tools are, there's an iPad app that's like, $15 that you could release if you wanted to start learning some rudimentary mixing things. There's all sorts of ways you could do that now to get started on that.
And actually, Pro Tools, the free subscription model one now, is actually pretty good. Like,
is it?
I know they had a free one a while ago, but it's actually pretty, it's usable. Like, it's worth having. Yeah. Thank you, both of you, so much for being so open about what you do and sharing your knowledge, your extensive knowledge. I think it's going to be very helpful to our listeners. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
You're most welcome. Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
So there we are. That's our episode on post-production sound. Be sure to check out the Disney Plus series Andor, where you'll hear Margit and David's audio skills on full display. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of post-production sound. And if you'd like to learn more about Margit and David's work on Andor, be sure to check out the show notes for additional resources. Thanks so much for joining us on the Soundstage Insider podcast. This episode was presented and produced by Jamie Muffett. Special thanks to Margit Pfeiffer and David Acord. And be sure to check out our sister podcast, In the Envelope from Backstage, which features intimate, in-depth conversations with today's most noteworthy film, television, and theatre actors and creators. We'll see you next time.